who wrote the Gospels, and specifically, who wrote the Gospel of Mark? Do the Gospels faithfully recount the teachings of Jesus? There are plenty of people out there who say we can't trust the Gospels. Today, we're going to begin a two-part series on the authorship of Mark. We're going to be looking at first the objection that the Gospels were written anonymously. Secondly, we're going to be looking at what the earliest non-biblical writers said about the Gospel of Mark. And in our next video, we'll look at the internal evidence about the authorship of Mark. So who wrote Mark? A lot of people will say, all of the Gospels, they were all anonymous. Nobody knows who wrote them. The names that you see, well, they were just added a long time later. In reality, it really wouldn't matter if we have the wrong names on the books, because that doesn't change the message or the theology. But we are considering it today because this is such a frequent attack upon the Scriptures. You see, in those days, writing without including your name was a standard. Authors generally did not say, I, John, wrote this book. Plutarch wrote 50 biographies, and he never once mentioned his name. Plato never wrote his name in his works. In the ancient world, works carried more weight without the author's name. Kind of like if you open up the encyclopedia, you don't get an author's name for each item. So why do we think that Mark wrote this gospel? We're going to be looking at what 5 church fathers said, starting with the one furthest away from the events of Christ, and then gradually moving closer. We'll start with Tertullian of Carthage, who wrote in about 207 AD. Next, we'll look at Clement of Alexandria, who wrote about 180 AD. The third one we'll look at is Irenaeus of Lyon, which is in France. He was the bishop of France. That was also about 180 AD. Fourth will come Justin Martyr, writing about 150 AD. And finally, we'll look at Papias of Hierapolis, which is an Asia Minor, writing in about 125 AD. So getting very, very close to the time that these were written. Starting with Tertullian of Carthage, what he wrote was that the content was by Peter, who used Mark as the writer. So he's saying that the content from the Gospel of Mark really comes from the Apostle Peter, but Mark was the one that wrote it. And he also said that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John have carried these names from the very beginning. The churches, this is what he says here, the churches planted by the apostles have vouched for these 4 Gospels, and they have been read in these churches, and no other Gospels have been read. Tertullian wasn't building a case for accepting the authorship, traditional authorship of the Gospels. He was using this as a known fact in his argument against a heretic by the name of Marcion. Marcion, you see, hated the Jews, and he hated Judaism. So he threw out the Gospels except for the Gospel of Luke, and then he edited it and published it with no name. Next, we come to Clement of Alexandria, around 180 AD, and he says that Mark wrote his Gospel by request from Peter preaching in Rome. Clement said this, and so great a joy of light shone upon the minds of the hearers of Peter that they were not satisfied with merely a single hearing or with the unwritten teaching of the divine Gospels, but with all sorts of entreaties they besought Mark, who was a follower of Peter and whose gospel is extant, to leave behind with them in writing a record of the teachings passed on to them orally. And they did not cease until they had prevailed upon the man, and so he became responsible for the Scripture, for reading in the churches. Next, we look at Irenaeus of Lyon in about 180. Again, similar time frame. He was the Bishop of France, and he wrote in a book called Against Heresies, Book 3, Chapter 1. He wrote the following: Peter and Paul proclaimed the gospel in Rome and founded the community. And after their departure, Mark, the disciple interpreter of Peter, handed on his preaching to us in written form. You see, this explains the purpose of the written Gospels. It was to replace the teaching of the apostles after they were gone, either because they had left town or because they had died. But the Christians wanted a permanent record so it couldn't be distorted and wouldn't be forgotten. Next we come to Justin Martyr, writing about 150 AD. His statement's not quite as straightforward, but bear with me. It is very meaningful. He wrote in the book Dialogues with Trypho, chapter 103, and he wrote this: In the memoirs, which I say were drawn up by his apostles and those who followed them, it's recorded that his sweat fell down like drops of blood while he was praying, and saying, If it be possible, let this cup pass. Now, what he was doing there was he refers to the memoirs of the apostles, and then he quotes the Gospel of Luke. In chapter 103, Justin says the memoirs were drawn up by the apostles and those who followed them. That's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. 2 of them were apostles, and 2 of them were those who followed him. He seemed to be referring to these exact same Gospels. He goes on to quote from these different books. Justin Martyr says that it said that he, speaking about Jesus, changed the name of one of the apostles to Peter. And it is written in his memoirs that he changed the name of 2 brothers, the sons of Zebedee, to a name I'm not going to try and pronounce because I will mispronounce it, but it means sons of thunder. And Mark is where that is found. So he's quoted Luke and Mark, and he says that it's the memoirs of the apostles written down by either the apostles or those who followed them. Only Mark has this information. So when he says it's the memoirs of Peter, he's referring to the Gospel of Mark. Justin Martyr also had a student named Tertullian who wrote a harmony of the Gospels called the Diatessaron, which literally means through the four. And in it, he uses Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and no others. And finally, we come to the year 125 AD, Papias of Hierapolis, which is in Asia Minor, and he worked together information about Jesus and tried to trace it to the apostolic sources. So he was a researcher on this. Said that he got some material from John the Elder, who was a disciple of Christ. And although he wrote in 125, he was interviewing these people in the 80s, not the 2000 80s, not the 1000 80s, but in the year 80s, some 50 years after the crucifixion of Christ. The elder used to say, quote, Mark, in his capacities as Peter's interpreter, wrote down accurately as many things as he recalled from memory, though not in an ordered form of the things either said or done by the Lord. For he neither heard the Lord nor accompanied him. But later, as I said, Peter, who used to give his teachings in the form of Kraia, but had no intention of providing an ordered arrangement of the logia of the Lord. Consequently, Mark did nothing wrong when he wrote down some of the individual items just as he related them from memory. For he made it his one concern not to omit anything he had heard or to falsify anything. And a chorea was a brief anecdote about a particular character. You might just say it was a short story, and that is a Greek word that means use. You know, the authorship of the Gospel of Mark was not challenged by anybody until around the year 400 AD, and this took place between Augustine the theologian and Faustus, a critic of Christianity. Augustine made the argument that we can know the authorship of various works, including the gospel, because there is an unbroken chain of evidence. And listen, if you can't trust the gospels to be a fair representation of what was written by these people, you can't trust any ancient work. Were the gospels anonymous? You know what? We really don't know. But we do know some things. The claims that Mark wrote the gospel occurs from the four corners of the Roman Empire, Tertullian in Carthage. And if you go 1,100 miles to the east, you get to Clement in Alexandria. Then if you go over 500 miles by boat, if you go by land, it's over 1,500 miles, and you get to Papias of Hierapolis. And then you go 1,800 miles to get to Irenaeus, which is in France, who is in France. And during this time, there was no social media, there was no postal system, there were no phone calls, yet all four of these arrived at the same conclusion, literally thousands of miles apart. Well, what about other gospels? Maybe we didn't get the correct one. In Contra Celsus, a book against Christianity, the critic only quotes from the four Gospels to try and discredit Christianity. He doesn't make use of any of the lost Gospels. The early church rejected these other quote-unquote Gospels because they cared about the genuineness of the writer. One final external argument for Mark as the author is simply this. If you were going to assign a name to a gospel to give it authority, why choose Mark? Who's Mark anyway? Why not choose Peter or Thomas or Andrew or Simon or James? Why not any of the other well-known apostles? Okay, well, we're going to stop there for now, and in the next video, we're going to look at some of the internal evidence for Mark's authorship. I hope this has increased your confidence in the Scriptures, God's holy word. And I will see you next time. Thank you very much, and God bless you.